Now, hello everyone. We're just waiting for people to log in, and this will just take a second or a couple of moments. So while people are logging in, I just want people to double check if they can interact with their gallery view at the top of their screen. And throughout this panel discussion, we will have spotlights focused on the different speakers throughout. But if you want to view everyone at the same time, please click on your gallery screen at the top right. Okay, so I think everybody's here now. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the part 2 of today's seminar, Familial Legacies. And in this discussion, the topic of focus will be cultural. It'll be a culture of making. So joining us for this panel discussion today, we have the National Design and Craft Gallery Generation Exhibition Curators, Muireann Charleton and Frances MacDonald. So Muireann is going to lead this panel discussion, and she will be joined by 3 of the exhibition makers. We have Katharine West, Róisín de Buitléar, and we also have Hugo Byrne. Also joining us from the Design and Craft Council Ireland will be Louise Allen. So throughout this panel discussion, you are very welcome to type any of your comments or questions in the right-hand side of your screen in the chat section, or underneath in the middle center in the Q&A section. Towards the end of the conversation then, we will relay your questions back to the panel. I will now pass you over to Muireann Charleton, who will begin this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline, and welcome everybody. You're all very welcome this afternoon to our session on the culture of making as part of the exhibition Generation at the Design and Crafts Gallery, the National Design and Crafts Gallery in Kilkenny. And of course, it's now an online virtual exhibition. So in particular, I want to welcome our special guest speakers today, Róisín, Hugo and Katharine. It's such a privilege to have the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon, so thank you so much for being with us. And for all our audience who've logged in to be with us as well, you're all really welcome, and thanks for joining us. And also to the co-curator, Frances MacDonald, who's here as well. And I'll just start by saying 1 or 2 short things about working with Frances on the exhibition Generation. We met, I would think it's probably about 2, if not more, years ago. And we were talking about craft and what we both were passionate about, which is the history of craft in this country, in Ireland, and the legacy that it has today. And it's just been such a pleasure working on this exhibition with Frances. And the whole theme of this exhibition, the curatorial question, is really to bring to the public for the question of how important our cultural legacy of craft making and tradition of making is in this country. So there's 8 makers in the show altogether, and we have 3 of them here with us. The exhibition crosses all disciplines, so we wanted it to showcase the wide variety of ways in which the theme of intergenerational sharing of skills is passed on, and also how that work, that legacy continues on and is reinterpreted today in the 21st century Ireland. So I want to just call on our first speaker, and I'm going to introduce Katharine West. I've known Katharine for many years now, and I'm just delighted you're here, Katharine, with us. And just to say a little bit about Katharine, Katharine is a graduate of the NCAD in Dublin, and she currently lectures in design, in ceramic design and industrial design in GMIT in Galway. Katharine grew up with the backdrop of an easel and paints and an artist studio, in her home. Her mother was Margaret Irwin West, and this exposure to visual art from a very early age influenced Katharine, and she's going to speak about that now. Katharine's work explores collective memory, including our connections with the past, the present, object, function, and space. And in particular, and really in an extraordinary way, her forms explore folds or pleats of matter and how they relate to the void and to the human form and to space. Also, Katharine, your brother is a maker as well, Richard West, and just to kind of bring him in as well, and he makes wooden vessels, and his work is part of the show. So, Katharine, you're also a Fulbright alumna, but can you maybe begin by telling us a little bit about growing up with your mother, the printmaker Margaret Irwin West, and what that experience of the culture of making was like for you?
Absolutely, I'd love to. I thought, first of all, we might just look at an image by my grandfather, H.E. West. I don't know, Caroline, if you can pull up that image. And I thought I might just start with the statement from Tim Ingold from his book Making, where he says, "Making creates knowledge, builds environments, and transforms lives." And so I think that's kind of primordial, you know, in a way. And so I was very lucky to grow up in a very visual family background environment. One of my kind of introductions to visual art was we had a very dark dining room in the bottom of our house, and on every wall there were several paintings that were copies of Dutch masters by my grandfather, H.E. West. So he was a businessman during the day, and then at night he made copies of Vermeers and Hals and all kinds of Dutch masters, Rembrandts. So I used to go into this dining room and literally you know, enter those environments. Those Dutch masters are very particular in terms of, you know, they're mostly interiors, and you can kind of enter into a whole world once you look at them. So I think that was, you know, a very particular introduction to visual art that I had. And I could go in there anytime I wanted. The piano was in there, these beautiful paintings were in there, and there were other objects, historical objects from my family, from my mother's childhood in India, all those kinds of things. So it was really a kind of an amazing space to go into. Then we could go on to the image of the Cubist painting by my mother, Caroline. Then, you know, as a child, as I was growing up, my mother, her studio was in her bedroom. Very different times. So she had a big bay window, and the easel was literally in the bay window. And so, you know, it wasn't easy for her to try and paint with 4 children, but she did. She was extraordinarily determined. So we grew up with that easel and those tubes of paint and the smell of oil paint, and my mother literally making work in front of us. So that was very, very special. And not so many years ago, she had a retrospective in Dublin, and what my brother and I found most extraordinary was that we hadn't seen some of the paintings for 30, 40 years, maybe more, maybe 50 years even. It was like us finding old friends again, because we'd literally seen them evolve as children. And so that was very, very special. And then we can move on to the image of the Connemara landscape. Yeah, landscape was a big influence also, both for my mother and myself. I grew up beside the water, and as a child, you know, we were always outside, and often my mother was drawing and painting while we were playing on the beach or swimming or lolling around. So you know, we were often watching her draw, you know, and observe the landscape. And she used to encourage us to look at the landscape in particular ways. And she was a huge influence on the way I look at objects in space and draw and observe. So I was very lucky. You know, a lot of people don't get taught how to draw from a very young age, but I you know, I was very lucky. My mother was quite exigent in terms of, you know, when you were drawing something, it's like, no, you hold the pencil this way, and, you know, perspective, and, you know. so I was very lucky. And then we also had a lot of visits to galleries as well. The National Gallery, you know, some of the paintings there were like good friends as well. And so just, you know, so that was very important. And I suppose as time went on, then I started to draw the landscape. I mean, what's kind of interesting about the fact that I started making objects was that I think I'm somebody who can absorb kind of visual material and observe it, but I'm not somebody who can, you know, put together imaginative composition, you know, so I was never going to be a painter. I was much more someone who was interested in forms and space, and, you know, in fact, my brother and I both took pottery classes when we were small. We're just 16 months apart. And my mother would be teaching on a Saturday morning, and we'd take pottery classes in the art school in Galway, in Dunleary. And so we kind of, you know, we were manipulating materials from a young age, and also, you know, we didn't have a television and things like that. So making was just part of life, and even down to, you know, the sewing machine was always on the table too, and if we were going out, we'd try and make something quickly on the sewing machine as well. You know, I suppose it was a particular way of living that a lot of people lived that way then, I think.
Katharine, if I could just sorry to cut across you there, but I think that's a really, really good point that might come up in our discussion at the end about living in that culture of making, and you know, which hopefully is coming back again. But you mentioned drawing and the value that was placed on looking, which is so wonderful. So what began your journey then into ceramics? Was it those early pottery classes? And how did you emerge with your own voice then within ceramics?
Well, I think the pottery classes were just, you know, like the fun of making things out of a malleable material. But then I went on to, you know, I went on to art school, and I thought actually I'd do something called design, you know, in a kind of vacuous sort of way. I didn't really know what that would really involve. But really at that time, I suppose the main emphasis in design was kind of, you know, more graphic design at NCAD. So then, yeah, I just decided that what I particularly liked doing was working with materials, and particularly with clay. And I was lucky, you know, I kind of rediscovered clay then, I suppose, and realised that that was something that I particularly responded to. I think as well, you know, the material is so malleable. I think that was something that kind of fascinated me with clay. Whereas, you know, we did work with Róisín, probably remembers us doing glass as well. We did glass and metalwork as well. But it was clay that kind of seduced my interest, yeah.
Caroline, you might put up an image of one of Katharine's contemporary pieces.
Yeah, maybe one of the pieces from the show.
There we go. Yeah. So Katharine, just thank you so much for that, and maybe just before you finish up, could you tell us a little bit about those extraordinary forms, those folds? And I know you're very influenced by the writing of Gilles Deleuze, but the whole notion of pleats and folds, just if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, I'd love to talk about that. I mean, obviously there are huge references to landscape in my work, and you know, throughout art school we were drawing a lot from the human figure as well. So landscape and the body were important as well. But Yeah, when my daughter was small, I was part of a reading group in the university in Galway. It was part of women's studies, and myself and my colleague Vivian Dick and a poet, Mary Dempsey, and various theorists we used to sit around a table once a week and try and dissect Deleuze and Guattari, and I just found that in relation to philosophy, I kind of read it more visually than because I lacked a theoretical background, and it was quite a bit after that that I discovered the full Deleuze's treatise on this notion of the pleats of matter. It actually comes out of, in a way, Baroque architecture and observing of the folds in relation to Baroque architecture. But it's always very nice to dip into or read some text that somehow relates to how you see things. And so Deleuze has been particularly important in that way. And, you know, that notion of pleats, I suppose it's something that we learn from our very early days of looking at sculpture. You know, if you think about the Greek and Roman figures, you know, with all those folds and pleats in their beautiful kind of clothes, you know, drapes. That became very important to me. The notion of matter itself is kind of so intrinsically linked to clay as a material, so that's very important as well. And then just some of the text in relation to Deleuze, I might just quote very briefly what he says about matter. Matter thus offers an infinitely porous, spongy or cavernous texture. Caverns endlessly contained in other caverns. No matter how small, each body contains a world pierced with irregular passages, surrounded and penetrated by an increasingly vaporous fluid. So that notion of matter and fluidity and solidity and shapes within shapes, you know, when I started to read that, it's like, well, that's fine. You know, that's kind of what I'm, you know, what the work is about, you know. So it was lovely just to find a kind of, you know, some text that inspired me to continue thinking about those kinds of interior passages and forms. And so a lot of my work over the last maybe 8 years or so has been a lot about housing a form within a form and these double-walled forms. And so that's been, you know, it's still something that fascinates me, really.
That's wonderful, Katharine, and thank you so much for that. No doubt there'll be lots of questions at the end and we can expand more on that, but that was such a wonderful insight, so thank you. I'm now going to ask our second designer, artist, Hugo Byrne, to speak to us. I'm just going to introduce Hugo by saying that he uses traditional and contemporary techniques to make his handcrafted knives. They are not only very functional and ergonomic, but they are also very, very beautiful objects as well. So he incorporates material, you know, 6,000-year-old bog oak, which is quite extraordinary, from Glenstall Abbey, for example, in some of the handles, pear wood from his own garden, and found materials from beachcombing as well. So Hugo is the son of two of Ireland's well-known artists, Mike Byrne, the well-known ceramic artist, and Mary Nagle, visual artist. So what I would love, Hugo, you're also an award winner, I should say, as well. You won the Future Makers Award in 2019, and you also won the Image Interiors and Living Magazine Award, the Emerging Makers Award as well. And you've also received an award from Limerick City County Council. So just to kind of mention that as well. But could I ask you to begin by maybe telling us a little bit about the culture of making for you in your family, growing up with two artists as parents, with Mary and Mike as artists, and maybe you could share that with us.
Yeah, well, we did indeed grow up. So Mary and Mike are they're both recently retired, but had worked in the art college here in Limerick for most of their lives, and so they went to the art college, and then they moved to Kilkenny, to Butler House, I think, is that right? So they spent many years there, so they always talk about Kilkenny very fondly, which I think is gas. It's kind of a nice little full circle there. But there was always never any pressure on my sister or I to be, to follow a particular path or anything like that. They had a very not lax, but sort of gentle approach to things like homework and schoolwork and that kind of thing. And there was always loads of room for expression and trying things out and, mistakes, really. Now, I always joke about, like, oh God, if I'd have wanted to become a solicitor or something, I wouldn't have stood a chance. I wouldn't have been allowed, but I would have, of course. But it was never going to happen. So we were always kind of making things as kids and all that sort of stuff. And then, in school, we were, lots of emphasis on art and music and that sort of thing. My sister Theo she's a professional musician now. So, there wasn't any particular, you have to do ceramics at all either, there was kind of whatever you were having yourself. So that was very good, I think. And I also think that they were both teachers, I think, was quite formative in that. Neither of them, teachers are always very careful not to just insist that their students do this and this and this. There's guidance, but there's also a certain amount of letting you go your own and fail or succeed in whatever you choose to do. You know what I mean? So it was handy that they weren't just artists and designers and craftspeople, but that they also were teachers. So there was very much, they were quite good at letting us find our own paths as well, if that makes sense.
It does, and that leads me to ask you, how did you find your path or your journey into knife making?
It was a roundabout enough. I went to NCAD, which was loads of crack, absolutely great time, and studied sculpture, which I thought I didn't really know what to do at the end of first year. I thought,
wow,
I'm not really sure what I want to do. I'll do sculpture, where you can kind of do anything, you know what I mean? You don't have to, it's a bit like kind of more multimedia, which was a load of fun, but I think was the wrong course for me in that I kind of thought, I want to make things, you know what I mean? I'm going to make things. And then I found in sculpture that before you made something, you had to have quite a good reason to do it, to want to do it, which I never had. I was always more, I'll just make it and work out the theory afterwards, which is all wrong, you know what I mean? So that was not a criticism of the course now at all, but I was the wrong guy for it. So after that, I started working in a restaurant, which was again loads of fun, but fairly difficult to stay creative while you're doing that. And after a few years, I was going mad, and I designed some furniture, just sort of as a little fun sort of creative project. I designed a few chairs to see really if this little design idea that I had would work, and it didn't at the first. Believe it or not, they were extremely uncomfortable, because I don't know the first thing about furniture design. But then I got them a little bit right and made them, and that kind of like sparked the bug of thinking creatively again, which was very exciting. And off the back of that, I applied for a internship in a place called Conservation Letterfrack, which is out in Connemara. And we went to visit the workshop. A friend of Mary and Mike's knew the manager there and said, "Oh, you have to talk to Sven. You have to talk to Sven. He's fantastic. He's just a great guy, but he's just really kind of interested in everything." So I went in, we said hello, and I was totally seduced by the workshop. I don't know the first thing about object conservation either, but I was just really, really amazed by all the machines and the tools and the diversity of the project that took place there. Restoring furniture or architectural joinery. There was no it wasn't just we do wood turning here or we do this here. It was a bit of everything. It was really cool. So while I was there, they gave me a project to design some chopping boards out of a few lumps of walnut that someone had dropped in. They said, oh, there's a project for the intern, you know, have a little design challenge for you there. So I was kind of racking my brains thinking, how am I going to do this? They're really perfect. They're gorgeous lumps of wood as it is. How am I going to adapt them? And then I kind of, they're you know, it felt a bit like trying to design the cart without the horse then in the end, you know what I mean? Like they were perfectly good chopping boards already. I would have just been spoiling them. But it felt silly designing the board without the knife to match. So I said to them, I said, actually, is there any chance I can maybe design a knife? And they were like, yeah, great. I think they were just thrilled that you know, to give me something to do. So they had all the gear and they had a forge. They had a load of books on steel and forging and knife making and things. And they were, and I had nothing but time. So they were really encouraging about that.
Just on that, Hugo, you mentioned forging steel. So, you know, for those in the audience kind of listening in, could you tell us a little bit about that process of forging steel? I know you and I, when we spoke on the phone many months ago, I just find it so fascinating. It's a really intricate process. Could you, you know, tell us just a little bit about that process of actually making the steel?
Yeah, I suppose what we were talking about before was making the Damascus, which is the name for like a many layered, like a laminated steel. So the way, this is a photo actually from was it last year or the year before? We went over to a guy called Joel Black. He's a blacksmith over in the UK, and made some steel with him. The way it works is, so I work with carbon steels, which are as opposed to stainless steels. So they patinate over time and that kind of thing. And Damascus is made out of them. And the way it works is you have two different types of steels. So, you know, you have A and B, let's say, and you would have some flat bar of each and chop that up. So you would make a stack then. So you have A, B, A, B, A, B. That would all be welded together and then heated up to welding temperature in the forge, which is bright yellow. And then under the power hammer, which you can see in the image here, you forge weld that together. So when you hit it hard enough, if it's hot enough, it'll stick. And you squish it out into a big flat bar. And then, so then you would have you would start off with 10 pieces of steel. So your stack would be 10 high, let's say. When you squish that out flat, and then you chop that up again, I think that was chopped up into 6. And that is stacked on top again and welded up. So you now have a 60-layer piece of steel, if that makes sense. 60 layers of A and B, A, B. And again, that was squished out. And then you can do that kind of indefinitely, as many layers as you like. I think we stopped at 60 for this one in the end. This knife here is where that was coming from. Excuse me. So after the Damascus, we then got stainless steel and clad that on the outside, and again squished it all out so that we had a kind of a sandwich, what's called sanmai, which I think means 3 layers in Japanese. So you had some stainless steel, then the 60-layer Damascus in the middle, and then stainless again on the outside. So that when you start to grind that and turn that into a knife, gradually the stainless is worn away on the bottom edge of the knife and reveals the Damascus. Well, I have a little scrap here. The stainless forge welding stainless steel is an absolute dose. And it delaminates like crazy, and it's really difficult. So that was a huge piece and a lot of work. That was the steel I got out of it. So I have a little scrap here that's gone delaminated on me, but we might try a little acid etch for fun, just to see if it'll reveal itself. So I'm not sure now, my camera's a bit dodgy, but you can see this kind of plain steel here. We'll dip it into the acid for a moment. See if it's going to do anything. It might not now. The acid is quite old and probably isn't as warm as it should be, but we'll see if you can make out the pattern as it emerges on the steel.
Yes.
Can you see there, sort of, you can see the difference between the Damascus and the carbon?
Yes.
So that's how that works, really. And that's what's involved in making Damascus steel.
Hugo, thank you so much. Thanks for that presentation. It does, and it's great to see the demo. No doubt there'll be lots of questions coming in around that towards the end. So thank you very much. I'm now just going to call on our third and final speaker, the artist Róisín de Buitléar, to speak. So just by way of introducing Róisín, You know, she's one of Ireland's kind of most renowned visual artists who works in a variety of media, in particular glass. She works in layers of meaning, using the material's inherent beauty and quality to draw the viewer into the work. Cultural heritage and shared histories are central to her practice. And her father, Eamon de Buitléar, was a recognised musician and wildlife filmmaker. And it's Róisín's own cultural heritage and legacy that informs her work practice today, and she's going to speak a little bit about that. But just to say that Róisín graduated from the NCAD also, and she teaches and lectures in glass here in Ireland and also internationally, and she works to commission, public commission and private commission, and exhibits internationally as well. And just if I can mention, one of Róisín's amazing projects is Islanders, which she won an award for, a Bonhams Award in 2019, and her Islanders project took place at Venice Glass Week in Venice. And for those of you who want to find out more about that, I urge you to check out the Instagram page for it, which is Islanders Glass. So Róisín, thank you so much for being with us today, and maybe you can begin by telling us what it was like for you growing up in a culture of making, and particular around the music and the love of music that you have and that your father had.
Thanks, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. Yeah, taking part in the exhibition has been a really interesting exercise for me, to try and look back at a part of my father's history that is not spoken about probably as much as his wildlife filmmaking was. For people who don't know who he is, he was Ireland's first natural history unit, really, as an independent filmmaker, and spent the 1960s and 70s and some of the 80s going around Ireland and showing Irish people what the beauty of the natural landscape was. And he was also an environmentalist in that he had a lot of campaigns going, trying to prevent destructive behaviours and talking about conservation before it was fashionable to talk about it. So alongside that and before that, he grew up on a river in the Dargle Valley, and had a salmon weir outside the window and was very close to nature. But music was also a huge part of his teenage years. And he became interested in traditional music and bought an accordion from somebody standing on a Pound Bridge, my mother told me the other day. And that's how he started playing the box, as we call it. And then obviously was in town in the city playing with people in different pubs, and met a number of different musicians, and met Sean O'Riordan, the great composer and classical musician and arranger, who was also very, very interested in Irish music. And together, Sean O'Riordan was at that time based in Cooley, in Cork, and my father was in the city. He lived in Bray, but he spent a lot of the time in the city. He had a business there. And in 1961, they had this incredible gathering of musicians under the name of Curator Muireann. And it was really, really groundbreaking at the time. It was led by Sean O'Riordan, but the musicians were made up of many of my father's friends who were from the city. And in this photograph that we have here, we have Paddy Baum, my father in the middle on the box, and Paddy Maloney on the right-hand side there, whom you may know as the leader of the Chieftains. And what they were doing at that time was, Sean was arranging Irish music, traditional tunes, but also very, very ancient music of great harpers that had been kind of buried in books, which are now really well-known tunes by Carolyn, for example, some incredible jigs and reels that were being played only in kitchens up until that time. And what Sean was trying to do by bringing it to the city was to bring it into a concert hall scenario. So in 1961, they made this concert called Racharucht an Riadig. And it wasn't just them, it was a number of different people. There were also poetry readings, and Dara O'Cahan was there, and Maura McEntee read her poetry as well, and Curator Muireann made their sort of debut in formal suits with Vicky Buzz. Now, my father never wore a formal suit ever after that, but they sort of had to bring it. It was in the Shelbourne Hotel, and they had to bring it as a sort of a grand performance. Some of you might have known, you know, the sort of extraordinary sounds of Misha Eira that have been played over the last number of years. That Sean wrote and arranged all that music, and also made a lot of different film scores. But what's really interesting about this story was that, you know, we're so dependent on technology, and here we are talking virtually. The growth of the learning of that music, and how Sean actually shared his music with the band of musicians who were in Dublin, was that Sean used to record on this kind of machine. This is a Nagra reel-to-reel machine, and he used to make the recordings of all the arrangements that he wanted the different musicians to play. So there were 11 or 12 musicians in the band, and he would send the tapes by post to my father, and my father would bring this small machine into the pubs where they were practicing. It was Capel Street, the Four Seasons, Capel Street, and they would play the tape, and then the musicians would learn the parts from that. So an extraordinary kind of slow weave, I suppose, is what you might call it. And here is a notebook of Dad's and his beautiful handwriting, where he made a lot of different notes about the kinds of music that, or the notes of different pieces of music that he had. And this kind of logging and noting exactly what was going on when all of the different musicians were playing became some of the texture of the music that they had. I also have a small notebook here. Yeah, there's 3 or 4 versions of it there, and also the program from Rakarach and Riedig, which was going to be in the exhibition. You can see there AABB on the notebook there, just on that tune. And there are, in traditional music, there are sort of different parts of the music. There is one series of phrases called A, which are classed as A, and then one series of phrases which are classed as B. And normally they're played A, B, A, B, A, B, or 2 lots of A and 2 lots of B in a session. But with Sean's arrangements, he was changing things around, and in kind of a jazz sort of way, that people could then have solos where they were playing parts of the tune singularly, and then you would have a number of instruments coming in, and then you would have the whole band come in, and it created this incredible electrifying atmosphere that had never been seen or heard before, and at the time it was enormously groundbreaking. In 1963, my father, they made this is reversed, it says Óriad sa Gaiety, and on the back it says Tafa the studio Eamon de Buitléar BO on Gaiety, and it was my father who actually recorded this live in the Gaiety, and Gaelin put it onto a record. And just how that legacy kind of carried on. So this is one of Dad's handwritten notebooks. And then later he formed a band after Sean died. The band split into 2 groups. So one became the Chieftains, and they went on the road and, you know, have made an incredible career of and brought so much to Irish music. And Dad wanted to concentrate on his filmmaking. And so he created this band called Curator Muireann, which was a less full-time occupation. But this notebook, of which also there is a version in the exhibition, is also an incredible sort of recipe book for tunes and for arrangements, because, you know, in performance you need to have a sequence of arrangements going along. So there are amazing groups of musical pieces in this, and this was put together by my aunt. There were 15 of these hand-made, linen-covered, made by my beautiful Aunt Nora Butler, who worked with my father as production assistant and animator for many, many years. And this is a really treasured possession that we have in the family. So just from the point of view of what I was showing for the work that I'm actually showing in the exhibition, it's a series of sound objects, and although the objects are there to be seen, what I'm also trying to do is to create this ethereal atmosphere through these performance of these pieces. So if you just go back to the red and purple piece, Caroline, these two pieces, so this is called Lift, the red one is called Lift, and my father used to describe when people were playing music, you know, if they weren't actually really feeling the music, there was no lift in the music, and in order to have a lightness and a kind of something that was really descriptive within the music, he described this as a lift. And inside this piece there is a whole series of small tiny glass beads or bauble, you know, round pieces that actually make a sort of a swirling sound. And they also make a kind of, it's a bit like a rain stick sound as well, and you can also beat this piece and you can also blow into it, likewise the other piece behind. And in making this, these pieces, first of all, to hear the sound of glass or to create sound that's absolutely new, because it is made of glass and the timbre of the sound changes with the thickness of the pieces. I've been working with Liam O'Malley and Peter O'Toole and Sheila Dinver, all contemporary musicians in Ireland, to make live performances using these pieces. And so bringing the fragility of the glass and the timbre, the tradition of working very intuitively with the music and the material so that it becomes a conversation has been an amazing thing to do for the last number of years. And I suppose I'm different, you know, in this scenario where these pieces have been shown before a number of times, and I'm not selling this work. So I'm working in a much more sort of ethereal kind of way, where I'm creating things that don't really exist and can't be remade or reconstituted, because every performance is different. And that depends on the dialogue between the musicians and the crowd. And that kind of goes back to what Ceoltóirí Chualann were doing, was really sort of drawing on the traditions of the crowd, but also reinventing the music so that it would become something very fresh and electrifying and very moving, you know, depending on the interaction with the audience. And so I suppose that just brings us back to the last slide that I have there of Alison Lowry's slide for Islanders, which was a project that we made in Venice last year. And I suppose it's quite relevant now, because here we are, you know, more isolated than we ever were. And this piece was, this Islanders project was a response to the Brexit negotiations and how isolated I was feeling as the discussions became more and more intense early on. And I reached out to island makers around the world to put together a piece of work that would signify what being an island meant to them. And so we made this incredible project, which was projected small slides, like a 35mm slide, but made of glass, everybody's personal expression. And we projected that in a live performance on Murano in a very, very old site of an old glass factory last year. So I'm hoping to bring that elsewhere around the world.
Oh, Róisín, thank you so much for that. And it was actually really wonderful to hear the impact of your father's passion for music and continuing your own work in this incredible way, and this in performance and craft and object. And I just loved what you said. His own words was the word lift. When people are really feeling the music, he used to call it lift. And then your piece is entitled Lift. That was gorgeous. So thank you very much for that presentation. I'm just really conscious of time, and I'm going to just call on Caroline to there's probably some questions, Caroline, from our audience, is there?
Caroline, can I just cut across there for a second? Yeah. Sorry, Muireann, Róisín, actually everyone, that was fantastic, and I think Róisín's what Róisín spoke about, I mean, has especially reminded us of how embedded craft is in our wider cultural heritage in Ireland and how important it is. I just ask one question, if you don't mind, Muireann, is just in relation, it's Róisín again, especially speaking, reminded me of Glenn Adamson wrote an essay for the publication that accompanies this this exhibition, and he talked about generation being a word that faces both ways, both past and present, and all of your work is innovative and it's forward thinking, especially Róisín and what you've done with sound objects. It's experimental, you know, and it's really, you know, of now. But I'm just, you know, how much that relies on the on what's from the past, the heritage, what is passed down to you, the knowledge and skills. You know, what you're doing is very forward thinking, but you're using very ancient skills in some ways.
Yeah, it's trying to, it's looking at how you can reshape what you know. I mean, I think that drawing on your past is a massive part of moving forward. You know, I think that's what anchors me, certainly, you know, in not only in my making, but also in how I think and where that huge energy and emotion comes from in order to make work. But I think the making skills, you know, are so important from the point of view of, you know, having the experience of passing that down, whether that was, you know, my mother at home showing me how to do things, you know, in a practical way. Katharine was talking about the sewing machine there. We were your sisters doing exactly the same thing, you know, whipping up a skirt before you go out to the disco or whatever. But yeah, it's something that came very naturally, and it's something that I see a lot of people falling back on. You know, when COVID started, certainly all of that kind of going back into making became very significant.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We do have a question, actually. One question is for Hugo. It is, how specialized is knife making and the Damascus still process? Are there many makers around the world doing this at the moment?
Yes, there's loads. There are loads of makers around the world doing it, and there's actually surprisingly like quite a few in Ireland. When I started maybe 2 years ago, I was like, oh God, no one's doing this. But actually, there's quite a good few people doing it in Ireland at really amazing levels. Like I know Rory O'Connor, I think, was he's sort of the Irish godfather of knife making. He taught a guy called Fingal Ferguson, who is a real superstar these days. So they're well worth looking up. There's Sam Gleeson in Clare, Paudie Ryan in Limerick is an amazing blacksmith. Turned kind of bladesmith, who's making amazing work. So it's very specialized. I think, you know, way back when, I think the local blacksmith was kind of like the local surgeon now. You know, it took 7 years to become a qualified blacksmith because you're making the tools that everyone was using. Excuse me. So while now it's a lot more like rocket science than it was back then, I think there's much more understanding about, you know, the chemical components and that kind of thing of steel, and how, you know, you understand temperature is much better, whereas in the past, you know, everything would have been done on the color of the steel as you heat it. You can say now it's at the right color, it's obviously at the right temperature. Whereas now, you know, you can kind of look at the recipe of what the steel is made up of, and you know then how it should heat treat or how it should anneal, that kind of thing. So, but at the same time, then you can make a knife. You can make a knife out of mild steel and just whack it enough times with a hammer or file it with a file, and it's, you know, once it's heat treated, it's a knife. It's no longer a soft piece of steel. It's a hardened piece of steel. So you can make it into a blade that will hold an edge, but depending on how you heat treat it, how well it's done, how it's tempered, the type of steel it is in the first place, within that, there's an awful lot of range for how decent a knife it's going to be. You know what I mean?
Hugo, we have another question for you also. It is, on reflection of the development of your work to date, can you recall your most enjoyable moments of inventiveness? I know.
Specific,
I don't know. That caught me off guard there, but
I suppose add something to that, Hugo, which I think would be really interesting. What's really a really interesting aspect of your work and something you share with both Mike and Mary is this use of found objects, and maybe just to mention that as well in your answer.
Yeah. Well, I suppose in terms of the original question, in terms of my creativity, I couldn't tell you, but just regard to knife making, there was an amazing moment was after I made my first knife. Delighted I'd made this, and I said, oh, I'll make my dinner with it. And that was a real aha moment. The whole, I made this thing and I spent weeks making it and was really excited, and that was exciting enough. That was good enough for me, you know. But then when I took it home, I used it to cut up my dinner, which I then ate and enjoyed. And that was like, oh my goodness, I'm going to get to use this every day. And I still use it every day. And I still use the first one I made. But that, you know, that the effect of like, here's a thing that didn't exist a couple of weeks ago, and then I created it, and now I get to enjoy using it every day until I lose it. You know what I mean? Which is just, that was amazing. I've found objects. I think that's really, I don't know. Again, the first knife that I made. Actually, the first knife that I made wasn't a knife at all. It's what's called a KSO, which stands for a knife-shaped object. Because it was unhardened steel. I was waiting for decent steel to arrive in the post, so I made this little oyster knife out of mild steel, unhardened. And actually, when I tried to open oysters with it, the blade was like, the oysters is too much for it. But that was made from driftwood, which I found at the beach that I was living near in Connemara. And I thought, oh, lovely. I used to go swimming there every day, and it was a beautiful piece of wood. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could make a knife using this piece of wood, and then get some oysters maybe from this beach and eat them on the beach. And that was something really nice and kind of full circle. Something romantic, I guess. It was quite a romantic thing.
Fantastic.
That at the time I was just delighted with. You know, I'd moved from Dublin out to the ends of the earth in Connemara, and was just so thrilled about the whole thing that there was a lovely way to end my time there, you know, with this with my driftwood knife. So we'll pretend did an amazing job at opening the oysters.
Róisín, we have a question. Thank you so much, Hugo. Róisín, we have a question towards you. It is, how can you comment on how your practice has changed over time? So you spoke about a lot about your father's work, but your work is very varied.
Yeah, it has. Well, I suppose the only consistent thing that I can, well, there are a number of consistent things, but the material is the consistent element. And I suppose when I started off, I started making bowls and functional ware. When I worked in lots of different studios around the world for other people, you know, that was a kind of a stable. I actually had an agent in England at one point working for me. And I think that would be a really good thing to bring back again, agents that actually go around and do selling for makers. I think it's a very underestimated idea. But even very early on, I was making sculptural pieces with water and colour and stacking and doing sort of different kind of experimental works. And I think what's really interesting to see when I look back over the work, because my work ranges from, you know, small objects to very large architectural scale work. It's really to do with light and shadow and storytelling. And the anchor is the cultural aspect of it. When I'm working on larger scale projects, I'm responding to a site, or I'm responding to a brief of some kind or other, and you know, that can change the content, but it certainly always has a storytelling narrative kind of aspect to it, and that is very much embedded in my own history and the history and culture of the country.
Thanks, Róisín.
I have just a question or two, if that's okay. And this is for all of the panelists. The first one is just, I suppose, whether you could comment on the broader impact in terms of your ethos, values and approach to life that growing up in a creative environment has had. And the other one is just in relation to the ongoing sharing and transfer of skills. And, you know, whether there is the moment where the digital environment in terms of tutorials on YouTube or these kind of webinars, the role that they have to play in terms of maybe encouraging younger generations to have an interest in the making process, and maybe what needs to happen then to actually get them from just looking online to actually making for themselves.
Maybe that's one Katharine could we ask Katharine to answer that one first, just in relation to education as well and GMIT?
Yeah, well, there's certainly, I think it was really interesting at the beginning of the whole COVID thing, people started to bake and bake and bake, you know, and we did that here as well. And it was that thing of kind of wanting to produce things, I think, you know, and to feel, I think people needed to feel like they were generating things at home, from home, you know. I don't know. I think it depends very much on the individual as to how much they relate to making on, you know, in relation to material online and things like that. I know my brother Richard pretty much taught himself how to turn wood from YouTube. You know, he's very much somebody who observes and interprets from material in front of him. But I think people work in lots of different ways. My experience from teaching in GMIT is, you know, a lot of people would come to art school with all kinds of ideas as to what they might want to do. But a lot of people have very little experience of working three-dimensionally because our school system doesn't really nurture that as much as working two-dimensionally. So if you think about from when you're very young, you learn how to make marks on a piece of paper, you know, and create illusion on a piece of paper, but you don't really always get exposure to working with materials. And what's really interesting, I always find that very interesting when I used to teach first years, would be the aspirations that people had. You know, mostly when people came to art school, they would have been exposed to painting, you know, and many of the people who came to art school wanted to work in painting or maybe textiles. But then some discovered this third dimension, you know, and they couldn't go backwards again, really. And so that's very interesting. But I think that making has been taken out of education, really, a huge part of the notion of making in primary education. And I think that's a huge loss. We did a huge amount of making in primary school. We did a huge amount of sewing with I was taught by nuns, and they were wonderful because every now and then it was all about switching off and simply making things. So you had whole afternoons where all you had to do was make things all day, and that doesn't exist in primary education anymore. And those days when you'd be just working with materials all day, you know, now the children are very programmed, and it's almost like in the school system, it's very like the modular system. It's not necessarily about making these lateral connections. It's lots of different subjects, and everything's very compartmentalized. And I think that's very, very difficult. I think if we could move back to a more lateral kind of model of education, be great. But there were a couple of things that were really interesting in terms of what Hugo was saying. In terms of making. One was the notion of colour in relation to forging metal, and there's also a lovely connection there where, originally people fired kilns using colour. And if you fire on a very regular basis, you manage to read the colour associated with different temperatures, you know. And, people talk about red heat and all these different temperatures. And I thought as well, you know, that thing of a kind of whether one reaches an epiphany at some point, you know. I remember that joy of making something functional, actually, Hugo, that you were describing. And that idea, I think, particularly when I studied in France, even though I was, you know, making sculpture by then, my teacher there, Michel Damut, he insisted, he was the professor of ceramics, he insisted that we all use the wheel as well. So I just had to make vessels. I had to make, I made hundreds of tea bowls and jugs and things like that. and I lived in a flat where we had nothing. So all my vessels were the vessels we used and ate from. And when I went to see people, I would just give them a vessel. But that joy of kind of drinking and eating out of something that you made yourself, I think that's something that I think everybody should be able to experience, you know, using something that they've made, and that, you know, and there's a great joy in that.
The novelty doesn't seem to wear off either. Well, it hasn't for me yet. It's still as
no. I don't throw very often. I throw for the students, and then I you know, I often don't even borrow glaze that I throw, you know. But when I do, I'm still kind of, you know, thrilled. Wow, you know, I made something that works. So it's very nice.
It was just a question for you, Katharine. There was a question for Katharine there from Hilary Morley.
Just the last point, Róisín, before
She wanted to put on for a second.
Yeah, I'd love to just come in on that last question there, Louise, that you asked, because it's pretty interesting to see what's actually happening. Just that you had two questions. So one, what was, you know, as a child, what was the influential thing? I think what was extraordinary about what I learned as a child very, very early on was that I had a voice, that my father used to ask us to critique his program after we watched it. And he would want to hear what my 7-year-old voice had to say, and my opinion counted. And I think to be listened to was something that was extraordinary at the time, and I hope I've been able to carry that on. And secondly, just in relation to your question about online interactions, I think it's incredibly difficult to teach something at the moment. I've been interviewing a number of artists who are teaching in institutions to try and teach something through glass online is extraordinarily difficult when you can't get to the material. But the Glass Art Society, which is the biggest glass conference, annual glass conference, is held in different places around America and around the world. And it has thousands of people who come and visit it, and interactions with many different artists. And they're going online tomorrow for the first time ever in their history. And it's a three-day conference, and there are sign-ups, and there are YouTube channel streaming and all that kind of thing. And in one way, it's opened up the whole thing for people all over the world to be able to interact with it. It's going to be a massive teaching tool and a connection tool. It doesn't replace actually physically going to the conference and, you know, making all that incredible networking, but it is actually networking in a different kind of way. And already we're making links with people through, you know, looking forward to different presentations and keying into different presentations. So I think it's an opportunity that we may not have thought about, which may open up things, certainly from the point of view of being able to rewind stuff and look at it again. And, you know, for Irish music, for example, there are incredible channels that you can learn instruments in a project base. And I see Martin Hayes has just launched his classes now as well. So I think that, you know, this opportunity has brought a whole different kind of level, given that you could get to your studio and, you know, do things step by step. And you had a good team of people, you know. As a filmmaker's daughter, I just see terrible films an awful lot of the time, and, you know, it just drives me absolutely crazy. But I think that there is a massive opportunity there, but I think that also people really need to feel and see and engage, you know, with the material themselves to really have the understanding. And I think that having an opportunity as a child to engage, if you ask, you know, the majority of makers will have had some kind of really deep engagement with the material. It may have been a visit to a workshop once, or it may have been a long relationship with a maker. The same kind of thing with a gardener or a baker or a chef. You know, you have this very resonant experience as a child that then stays with you for the rest of your life and make you make decisions later on about how you're going to, you know, follow that path.
Yeah, thanks, Róisín. I totally agree. I think you need both, but actually there's a huge opportunity now in terms of the audiences that we can reach. And I suppose just the realization of the global audience and how much we can interact online. So I might try and tune into Glass Art Society a little bit tomorrow, if that's possible.
Yeah, there's plenty on online. You can just go on into Glass Art Society. But really exciting. I know from one of the names coming up on the screen that we're talking to somebody in New York. You know, it may be amazing to hear where people are from and where they've logged into from for this seminar. And hello from Dublin.
Great.
Susan, was there another question there?
Yeah, there was just a couple of questions in, one from Hilary Morley there, and she was putting this question to all the panel actually. How has COVID-19 impacted your creativity? Anyone like to take that?
Well, yeah, you know, I think COVID-19 is such a huge challenge, isn't it? I think what's very challenging is what Róisín was alluding to, the whole notion of something being experiential and also the tactile. You know, that's something that we've been worrying terribly, you know, as a faculty, teaching faculty at we've been worried terribly about how that can continue, that experiential notion during COVID-19. It's an enormous challenge, I think, but it's also, I suppose, in a kind of abstract way, it's what you always wish for, that everything would close down and that you could just live in your own space and make, and you know, there's so many things that just use up so much time every day normally, like commuting and, you know, all those kinds of things. And you know, I suppose this COVID-19 can be seen as an opportunity in terms of simplifying one's life, you know, and distilling it into the kind of elements that really matter to you as an individual. But obviously you can't control all those choices. I'd certainly at this stage like to you know, interact, you know, in a real environment with people more, you know. But having said that, you know, I've certainly enjoyed, you know, discussions with students and colleagues through Teams, you know, and those have worked quite well, I think, and discovered that we can do those. I think it's been good.
That's great. Does Hugo, do you want to come in on that point as well? How is it for you? Your studio within your garden? Yeah,
I'm very, very lucky in that regard, but it's just a funny note when you said, how has it affected your creativity? At the start of this lockdown, you know, like Katharine, you were saying, everyone is taking up baking in the world. You know, you can't get flour for love nor money. But I remember when this lockdown came, I kept thinking like, oh God, this is great. What extracurricular activity am I going to take up with all this free time? You know, I was so excited. And then I was sort of getting up and go to work every day and working away and finishing up the evening and going, okay, extra time. So, but I don't actually have any free time with it because I'm still working away as much as usual. So I'm kind of sickened in that regard because I'd love to be like, oh great, I'll take up the piano. Now's the time. But at the same time, like, you know, I know how lucky I am to be able to keep working, doing something that I love as well. It's great, you know. So it's pretty. I'm very lucky in that regard. That's great, Hugo. And Róisín, for you?
For me, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, to tell you the truth. I couldn't get to my studio once the lockdown happened, and as I understood it was coming in, my projects were folding one by one, and a lot of them have to do with building sites, and you know, so obviously building sites have reopened now, so the projects are going to be delayed, which means your finances are delayed, etc. And then performances and other interactive projects have closed, absolutely shut down without being postponed because of not knowing how it's going to ride out in those gatherings of people and festivals and all that kind of thing. So initially that was an enormous shock, and then the next sort of wave that came was this expectation of being creative and you know, this time that you had been waiting for to be creative, where you didn't have projects that you were trying to, you know, reach deadlines and stuff. And I found that actually, you know, sort of trying to trust the process that, you know, while living in this kind of mad trauma of what was happening to the world and where we were going. You know, not feeling creative and feeling a responsibility of not feeling creative, not being able to get to the studio, not being able to make, you know, everything kind of tumbling into itself. And so, you know, I think we have to be honest as well about, you know, we react to things given time to percolate, and, you know, it may be fine if you have a product that you're, you know, trying to remake, or that you have a series of kind of deadlines that you're working with, and you have materials in front of you, but it's not that easy when you're working in a kind of a very abstract way. I travel a lot for reaching studios and making work and collaborations with lots of different people internationally, and so, you know, that whole world has kind of shifted completely for me, and I have been, you know, amazingly able to create some pieces, but it's not in a showboating kind of way. It's very, very personal responses to my own trauma, I suppose, and what I've been experiencing. But I think it'll be really interesting to see what comes out of this. What I do see is that there is far more humanity and community awareness, and certainly a huge awareness of our environment and what that brings when we stop and get off this wheel we've been on for a very long time.
There's one last question there, and that's from Patricia Duff. At what point did Katharine, Hugo and Róisín realize that they were carrying forward the legacy of their parents as creators?
I think probably from the day I could speak, I would say. I learned to speak Irish as my first language, so that has been a legacy from the very beginning, you know, continuing a language and then working through that whole cultural aspect has been absolutely embedded from the day I was born, I think.
I suppose myself, not too long ago now, when I moved home from Dublin, I moved home just for the summer between jobs. I was working in television, and I said I'll move home for the summer and make a few knives and wait for season 4 to be approved, and season 4 didn't get approved, so I ended up staying here and making knives full time. But moving back in with Mary and Mike was cool. I didn't think it would be, but actually it is. It's quite cool living with the two of them, because they're working all the time as well. So there's a real creative hot pot at home. You know what I mean? And we bounce things off each other an awful lot, and help each other out, which is great. So I think that from that I've kind of realized that it's you know, that it's much more. It's much clearer that, oh, but here's why I got all these skills, and, you know, that's kind of, it was always going that direction, you know, so that's quite cool.
Yeah, I think for me, I think the kind of various languages. It was very interesting that Róisín spoke about her first language, but there are languages and ways of communicating that forge particular links between your parents for you as individuals. And I think probably every child in a family has a particular link or way of doing that, you know, depending on what their thing is. And I think for me, as a you know, a person growing up, my kind of link to my mother was that visual preoccupation with drawing and looking, and you know, that was my little line of communication with her.
Oh, thank you all so much for that. I think that's just been wonderful, and I'm just conscious we've gone quite a lot over time, so I might just draw the discussion to a close, if that's okay. Unless, Frances, was there any final question from you?
No, I suppose I just wanted to mention we did have 8 exhibitors in Generation, and 2 of them were unable to participate in the seminar today. I mentioned Ryan Connolly earlier, and I guess we just want to mention Alla Sinkovich as well. Alla was from Belarus, am I right, Muireann? Sorry.
Yes, Northern Ukraine, Belarus. She
studied in NCAD, and I think has looked very much to a material she would have been familiar with growing up, which was felt, and this lovely pair of boots that she inherited from her family. But she reinterpreted this material in a completely new, fresh and unexpected way, created these wonderful garments that are probably the first thing you see when you came through the archway to head to the exhibition. So I just want to give Al a mention as well.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for that.
To work with all of you, with Róisín and Hugo and Katharine. It's lovely to see your work and to learn something new about you and the way you work and what has inspired you, and of course working with Muireann as always.
Yeah, and just to echo that, thank you Róisín, Katharine and Hugo. Like, it has been a privilege to listen to you and to share your stories that are both professional stories but also deeply personal stories. So thank you so much for that, and we hope and pray and cross our fingers and everything and toes that we will have a get together and be able to celebrate the exhibition at some point in the future in Kilkenny in the National Design and Crafts Gallery. But for those of you listening, it is virtual at the moment, and it is online on NDCG.ie. But hopefully I look forward to seeing you all in the future to celebrate in person.
Can I just say thank you to all the participants today, to Francis and Muireann for chairing the two really informative and enjoyable panels, and we will be sharing the recordings. The first one is already up on ndcg.e/learn/adults, and the next one will be following, and there's lots of great content from the makers there too, and it's been a privilege to be part of it today.
Thanks very much, everyone. Really appreciate it. Cheers.
Thank you.
It's been a
Thanks,
pleasure.
Francis.
Until the real lifetime, it'll be great.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.